thanks to the Asian Society India Center for organizing this timely discussion in partnership with the Policy Institute. Here at the Asian Society Policy Institute, we've just published a new paper called Nature and Nurture, How the Biden Administration Can Advance Ties with India. And as Inachi mentioned, this is a very timely event. We just saw yesterday, Joe Biden and Kamala Harris were inaugurated as the next president and vice president of the United States. In what was a historic day, Kamala Harris became the first woman, first Black American, first Asian American, and Indian American to hold the office of Vice President of the United States. We are very fortunate to have an august and knowledgeable panel of experts with us today to discuss this historic moment. So let's turn to them right away. Prime Minister Rudd, Ambassador Biswal, Ambassador Menon, Kevin, Shankar, Nisha, if I might. We saw a historic scene yesterday amidst an unprecedented security lockdown in Washington, D.C. Thankfully, everything went smoothly and safely, and Joe Biden wasted no time signing around 15 executive orders to begin overturning some of the policies of his predecessor, Donald Trump. So just to get this discussion started, briefly give us a sense of what this moment means for the United States and for the world. Kevin, we might start with you.
Well, thank you very much, Anubhav, and to our entire team at the Asia Society India Center. Good to be with Shankar and good to be with Nisha, and to distinguished professionals in the field that we're here to discuss in this gathering. A quick couple of observations about the inauguration. I think the view across the world and across Asia was, by and large, one of a huge sigh of relief that we appear to be entering a period of greater normality in American domestic politics. That matters because the external perceptions of the Trump administration were increasingly one of a dysfunctional America across the board. And that both impacts the perception and the substantive foreign and security policy standing of the United States as a regional and global actor. So of itself, the change from an irrational presidency to a rational presidency with a highly experienced team of professionals behind him is a huge development in itself. Two or three other quick comments. I think if you look carefully at the inaugural address and the actions which the president took on his first day, we could say that the number one priority plainly is to begin to heal the fundamental political divisions which have emerged across the fabric of American society. If we were to do a speech analysis, 80% of the speech is about the politics of unity as opposed to the politics of division. And that underlines the task ahead for Joe Biden. But I do believe he's well equipped to execute it. Number two is the beginnings of the message about the building and rebuilding of the economy in the post-pandemic period for the United States. And there's a deep awareness within this administration that unless the economic rebuilding task happens and happens well and happens quickly and happens in a way which deals with traditional deficiencies in infrastructure, school education, and the rest, that the underpinnings of American global power will in fact erode. And the third point, which is clear, albeit in a short part of the inaugural address, is his attitude to the world at large. And there we saw, and I think, a critical paragraph, what he said about the importance of the United States now rebuilding its alliances around the world and re-engage in the institutions of global governance. And that is a very clear message about where the administration will now go. To conclude, Anubhav, I think we can all be skeptical about the speeches delivered by politicians. I've been one and I've given a lot of speeches. But when you come to a presidential inaugural, a huge amount of work goes into it across the most senior people in the Biden administration. They mean what they say on these three core questions. And I believe, therefore, America is off to a good start day one. But I look forward to the rest of the conversation.
Thank you, Kevin. Ambassador Menon, from where you sit in India, what does the start of the Biden administration mean?
I think yesterday was a real moment of hope, with great promise for the future. And I speak for myself. I mean, at times of lockdown, you can't be sure how many people you speak for. But the fact is there are three good reasons for that hope for the future, apart from what Kevin mentioned, the return of sanity, as it were, or rationality to policy making. The first for me is the celebration of diversity, of professionalism, of expertise that we've seen in the constitution of this administration. The people who have come, what they've said. I cannot think of a recent administration where people who are destined to hold very high office have actually expressed themselves so clearly across the board in public in the last few months, in the last 9-10 months. And most of that has been very reassuring because they've shown not just what many restorations do, a desire to go back to the past, they've actually shown an awareness of how the world has changed and of how they want to deal with this changed world. And that's my second reason, because we've heard President Biden and the others speak of the importance of working with allies, with partners, with others. And that bodes very well for countries like India who are looking to deepen their partnership with the US across the board. India-US relations are in good shape. It's been a bipartisan effort on both sides. And frankly, I don't think they've been in better shape, but they can be even better. And there is a lot more to do, especially in today's situation. So that's my second reason, the emphasis on allies and partners, on working together, on getting back to normal diplomacy and using the instruments of state. Thirdly, there's what I found reassuring. I'm not sure how many people would agree with me. You know, there's a tendency for administrations to look backwards, to let their predecessors set the agenda. But this one has not done that so far. Everything it's said has been looking forward. And it's very easy to slip into that negative frame of mind. We've seen previous administrations who spend half their time refighting the election and other issues against the past. But that's not what we've heard at all from President Biden and from the rest of his administration. And that's my third reason for really looking forward with hope. So I do think we're at a real moment of hope and opportunity. It's not going to be easy, no, but then the world is never an easy place. It is a messy place. But everything I saw yesterday made me feel a lot more optimistic than maybe I had for some time before that.
Great. Nisha, as Ambassador Menon just mentioned, this relationship is really in a fairly solid footing. We've seen 3 successive U.S. presidents advance the relationship. Now, at the outset of the presidency of Joe Biden, how do you think what does this mean for the relationship going forward?
Well, thank you, Anubhav. And it was an incredibly emotional day yesterday. The U.S. is facing just unprecedented challenges, and so are we around the world facing unprecedented challenges. And so, President Biden coming in and focusing on how we can, one, bring the country together. And you saw that not only was that a message that was given out by the president, but Republican and Democratic leadership from Capitol Hill and from states kind of echoed that call for unity and need to return to civility in discourse. And that was very important. The need to really lead in addressing the pandemic. And this is where not only do we need to lead domestically, but lead internationally and work collaboratively with our friends and partners around the world to tackle this crisis, as well as the ensuing economic crisis that COVID brought on, and look at some of the inherent discrepancies and distortions that have exacerbated the impact of that economic crisis on some more than others, both within the United States and around the world. the climate crisis, which he has obviously prioritized in his day one actions and in his appointments. And then the need to restore our global partnerships and alliances and institutions. In all of these areas, I see India being a factor of advancing many of these areas. For example, on the political issues in the United States, the ties with India are one of the areas where there's common ground in the prior administration and the incoming administration, and the bipartisan nature of the U.S.-India partnership in terms of its support and its priority placed on it by both parties. When it comes to COVID, I think there's been a recognition that we need to partner together with India in addressing the production and deployment on a mass scale in the United States and around the world. And I think you're going to see outreach on that front. Clearly on climate, we have a track record between the United States and India on important collaboration in advancing the Paris Accord, but also in the steps that India has taken to really focus on bringing up renewable technology. And I think that there will be a return to a much deeper partnership between the US and India on climate. Global institutions, and how the U.S. needs to come back in to reestablish its commitment to multilateralism, to global institutions, and to our bilateral relationships and alliances. And India will be important not only on the bilateral front, but also because of the important role it plays in the UN, it's on the WHO board and so many other institutions as well. And then finally on the economic front, where the US-India economic corridor has become a much more consequential one, and where we will certainly see areas of contention, but also major areas of opportunity. So I see the US-India partnership as being increasingly important, but also much more broad-based as we move forward in the Biden administration.
Great, thank you, Nisha. One of the challenges that we're certainly looking at, both countries share, is China. The paper I've just published argues that there's really an opportunity for U.S.-India relations today in the aftermath of the Sino-Indian border clashes in Galvan Valley this past year. Now, there's a tremendous convergence of interest between Washington and New Delhi when it comes to the China question. What isn't completely clear is what both capitals will do with this convergence and how far both capitals are willing to go. So I'd like to ask each of you about that. Kevin, perhaps you could start. Washington and New Delhi have gone back and forth in the past over about how tough they're willing to be on China. There's some concern in India, for instance, under Obama Biden administration, that the U.S. backtracked a little bit on South China Sea. And so given that history, do you think that we're at a similar stage where you'll start seeing a more concerted line coming out of New Delhi as you have seen in Washington?
I think there are fundamental principles at play, Anubhav, which go to the heart of geopolitics here. And that's about the balance of power between China and the United States and between China and India and China and the rest of the world. If you look at the world as seen through the lens of Beijing strategic analysis, it sees the correlation of forces, an old Soviet term, as moving steadily in its direction. The projections are that gross domestic product, as measured by market exchange rates, that China, by the end of this decade, will pass the United States as the world's largest economy. As you know, it's already by a factor of 4 or more times the size of the Indian economy. On the question of the military in East Asia and the West Pacific, in the course of this decade, depending on what the United States now does, there is a high probability that there will be military parity at a regional level, although not yet at a global level, of course. And on the technology question, the third big, as it were, barometer of national power, at least as China sees it. There is a huge task on China's part to achieve the self-sufficiency that it seeks in order to deal with its great gap in terms of semiconductors, chips and microchips, so fundamental to the artificial intelligence revolution. And that's where China currently lags the United States by several years. So why do I say this in response to your question about will there be a common, as it were, view between Delhi and Washington on the China question? I believe the driving forces underneath this in terms of the evolving power dynamics will push Delhi and Washington closer together. That is at work. And we've seen, as evidenced by comments from both Shankar and Nisha, that the overall state of the India-US relationship is in good order. It has been heading in a positive direction for a considerable period of time. And as others have said, it enjoys high levels of bipartisan support in both countries. So here is the question for deliberation in Delhi and Washington, really, is that given the current dynamic of China's rise, which is rapidly now unfolding, particularly in a post-pandemic world, where China has emerged economically in better shape, it seems, than much of the rest of the world, including the United States and India. Does the dynamics at play at this level of fundamental geopolitics bring about a deep paradigm shift in the way in which Washington and Delhi now view the future of the India-US relationship? It's not that this relationship is in a bad state of repair. It's not. Enormous progress has been achieved in multiple areas. But given frankly, the dramatic nature of the challenge now, which is now perceived coming out of China, India's significant border conflict in the middle of last year with China, will we now see this drive the bilateral relationship much more rapidly into a direction which is more intimate in security terms, more intimate in foreign policy terms, more intimate fundamentally in economic terms, trade, investment, capital markets, technology, and the rest, more intimate in terms of getting rid of these crazy American restrictions on specialist scholars and students and workers from India working in the United States, as well as intimate on, I think, a core priority, what I know to be a core priority of the Biden administration on climate change, and causing India to walk faster and harder in that direction. But as I say, the paradigm shift, bringing these two countries fundamentally closer together in a level of structural integration, which we've never seen since Indian independence in the 1940s. I think in Washington, we see a view on the part of the senior personnel of this administration to want to move in that direction with India. And the question for Delhi is does Delhi wish to move as significantly and as rapidly in that direction with the United States? But this will be, I think, a fundamental opportunity given the driving forces coming out of geopolitics that I began my remarks with just before.
Great. Master Menon, that last question that Kevin hinted at, which is this idea of what India will do. As you know, India has long valued its strategic autonomy. Do you think stronger U.S.-India strategic partnership to balance China's rise is now at hand? Or do you think there are still questions in the minds of Indian policymakers when it comes to a closer partnership with the U.S. Vis-a-vis China?
There's three parts to this. It's not just what India and the US want and do. It is really a triangle. It also matters what China does. And we've seen in the last few years a crisis in India-China relations because of what China did on the border since spring 2020. We've seen an increasingly adversarial China-US relationship, increasing contention in that relationship. And that seems to be bipartisan, this adversarial view of China as a potential peer competitor, potential rival. No, maybe not entirely as a threat, but certainly as a rival. And thirdly, and for me, this is as important, a Chinese determination, especially after the last 4 years and what they've seen as US policy and this emerging US consensus on China, political consensus, a determination to diminish their dependence on the US, the rest of the world, and to increase their comprehensive national power. I mean, they have their equivalent of Atmanirbhar Bharat in dual circulation economy. And these dependencies that Kevin talked about in technology, semiconductors, but financial sectors and various sectors, you can see a conscious effort now to move away from that, even if China-US relations are stabilized or restabilized under the Biden administration. So yes, the obvious logic is that you'd get much closer India-US relations in response to this worsening of both our relationships with China. But this is not the first time this has happened. It's not as though we've seen exactly this similar kind of worsening of both relationships in the late 50s, early 60s. And it didn't result in the kinds of results that we wanted because both sides had different views. India and the US had different views of how to handle that China. Today, there is much more congruence in the view of China. And it's been expressed in various forms at the highest level by not just between the last administration and the Indian government, but going all the way back to the Obama administration. So it seems to me that, frankly, the consequences of what China did on the border especially will lead India to a much closer relationship and to a willingness to invest much more in that relationship and in the strategic aspects of that relationship. And this is where I'm actually even more, where I actually believe there is much more opportunity here on India-US relations. India-US relations are more than just the glue of their relationship with China or the China effect. India-US relations, from an Indian point of view, are essential if India is to transform itself into a modern, prosperous, secure state. So it is not just about China. That will go up and down, both for the US and for India. And that certainly provides a certain level of strategic congruence, but there is more to this. So many of the issues that actually crop up in India-US relations are not all directly related to China. If you think of the trade and economic issues, these are not issues that actually crop up because of China. And I don't think that you will get into a situation where India has an opportunity on climate change, for instance, with the Biden administration, which is in its own interest. It's not because of China that India will engage with the Biden administration on climate change. There's just so much more that we should do in our own interest on renewable energy, on a whole host of issues, on health, for instance, on COVID, on vaccine rollouts. These are things that we can do together, but that's not China related. So for me, therefore, this relationship has tremendous potential, quite apart from the China factor. The China factor helps. I often tell Indian friends that we have a lot of our friends thanks to the Chinese.
Great. We'll come to some of the India's domestic prosperity and power issues, but Nisha, the same question to you. You know, U.S.-India strategic and security ties today are stronger than they have really ever been. How do you see the Biden administration taking advantage of the congruence of views about China that we just spoke about?
So I do think that the U.S.-India relationship is important in its own right because of the convergence of values and perspectives of how we see our goals and objectives in the global order. And, you know, as U.S. and India, as both principally adherents to a rules-based international order and to a stable and peaceable, Indo-Pacific, I think, are going to be aligned in that sense. And the convergence between the US and India also in investing in our global institutions, particularly as India becomes more and more invested in and playing leadership roles in these institutions, I think is going to also be there. But China does become an animating factor in shaping that convergence and perhaps the trajectory of that convergence as well. There is, of course, a holy ground in India on strategic autonomy and what has animated its doctrine since its inception. And yet, at the same time, that autonomy does not preclude more fundamental kind of aligning of its strategic planning and thinking. When I was assistant secretary, I think one of the things that we kept saying that we wanted to move towards was the ability of our planners, of our, analysts to be able to sit together and map out what the decade ahead would look like, rather than just dealing with the tactical day-to-day. How do we fundamentally start sharing perspectives about what the decade ahead is going to look like, and how we see threats and challenges, and how we see areas of opportunity? And that's where the convergence really starts to derive from. And so I think that will be the case. Now, the economic front is where we really need to then work much harder, because while we have that understanding of the strategic competition and rivalries, we still tend to look at the economic issues in a more parochial and often more protectionist way. And at the end of the day, it inhibits the growth of our own economies. I think India would be a more consequential industrial power. India would be a bigger, greater economic power if it were to take a different approach on its own economic growth and, look at the U.S.-India partnership in a different way. And I think that the same holds true for the United States, to be able to approach this fundamentally in a more strategic way, knowing that there are, contentious issues that need to be worked out. But if you have an overarching goal and ambition that animates a trade dialogue and discussion, then it becomes a little bit easier to strike the compromises in both directions.
Great. And, switching a little bit over to economic engagement. So on the campaign trail, Joe Biden declared that he would work more consistently with allies and partners in the Indo-Pacific. Australia, India, Japan, which are all part of the quadrilateral security dialogue, are of course a part of that picture, as are other US allies and partners in the region. But I want to talk a little bit about regional economic engagement as well. So in some ways, you've seen the United States and India take some pointed steps back in the international economic engagement towards the region. You saw the United States lead the Trans-Pacific Partnership Trade Agreement under President Trump, and India last fall left the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement and is now, as we all know, is not in TPP, is not in RCEP, and it's also not included in the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation Forum. So China, on the other hand, while this has been happening, has been very busy strengthening its global economic engagement and presenting itself as a champion of globalization. You've seen this through RCEP. You've seen this in the recently announced investment deal with Europe. So given these developments, do the US and India need to play catch up in the region from the perspectives of trade and geoeconomics? And is this a problem for the strategic partnership and for both countries in their desires to really shape outcomes in the region? Nisha, why don't we start with you on this one first?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right that the US and India have to play in some ways. China has put some major points on the board. And a lot of the work that was done by the Obama administration on bringing TPP together, unfortunately, we were not able to take that across the finish line. And so the region has moved on from that and continued to move towards greater economic cooperation and integration. And yet the two major outliers are the United States itself and India. And so I think for both countries, they're going to need to rethink and reshape their own approaches to trade. Now, I know that there's a lot of complexity, particularly in democracies where there's been a rather populist sentiment that has come up that is anti-trade and anti-globalization. And yet at the end of the day, we're going to have to address that sentiment and be able to explain the bigger impacts and positive effects that trade poses, and perhaps deal domestically with some of the dislocations and deal with some of the areas where trade has an adverse impact on particular communities. So I think that is a priority as we think about a post-COVID economic recovery.
Master Menon, the Indian ministry has increasingly voiced problems with free trade agreements. The Indian government has reviewed the free trade agreements it already has in the books. We saw the decision on RCEP. Where do you think the current, the Modi government at the moment, what is their general outlook on trade and regional economic engagement, broadly speaking, and what challenges does that pose for the United States?
Well, I'm not sure that I can speak for the Modi administration, Modi government, but I'd like to just make two simple points here, which are obvious. One is you can't run a political military engagement with Southeast Asia, ASEAN, Asia, even India, US, unless it has an economic leg to stand on. And I think that's the risk that both India and the US face as a result of what's happened in the last 4 or 5 years. The problem is that COVID, the pandemic, and the economic crash that it brought with it have actually strengthened protectionist instincts in both India and the US. So this is actually, and this is my second point, this is the part that I find hardest to predict or to foresee. There's still a debate in India on the wisdom of having left RCEP, of how, and on basically on how far self-reliance can shade into autarky. Where exactly on that spectrum do these calls by the Modi government for Atmanirbharta, for self-reliance, how far do these go towards protectionism? The record is not very optimistic. We've raised tariffs for the last 4 years, but that doesn't mean that self-interest will not drive us to find the right solution. It's just the question, I think, is how long. But honestly, this is the part that I find murkiest to actually predict.
Kevin?
Well, in domestic political economy and in international political economy, we've never advanced beyond what I describe as the Clinton doctrine. And the Clinton doctrine is, it's the economy, stupid. And anyone who thinks that we can provide any realistic analysis or prognosis or recommendations on geopolitics disconnected from where the economic center of gravity goes in the Indo-Pacific and globally for the future is not getting the full picture. Secondly, the Chinese have well understood this message for the last 40 years. The truism is true with China. They have planned effectively for the long term. Deng Xiaoping's underpinning wisdom that Chinese state power could only be advanced militarily and geostrategically on the back of strong economic growth over decades has laid the foundations for everything that we see today. The third point, therefore, is will the United States and India learn from this? And therefore, rather than a series of incremental steps in terms of their own bilateral economic relationship, let alone their wider approach to regional economic integration across the rest of East Asia, will it still be incremental, a bit here and a bit there, or will it be deep structural and paradigm shifting driven by China's rise? So going to the mechanics of it, the ridiculous protectionist measures imposed by the Trump administration against India, this needs to be rectified quickly. On the question of regional trade strategy, and I take the point now just made by Shivshankar, that is the self-reliance strategy being embraced by Prime Minister Modi. As a piece of domestic political rhetoric, I understand it, particularly in the pandemic world. Many heads of government around the world are experimenting with similar forms of language. It sounds good politically. The problem is it actually slows economic growth over time. My strong recommendation to our friends in India is to reappraise RCEP, to appraise afresh joining APEC, and to think even laterally about where it goes to with the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership. China is in APEC, China has joined RCEP, and China now through Xi Jinping has said that it wishes to join the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And so therefore, either the United States and India are serious about becoming, again, deeply integrated economic players across the Indo-Pacific region, or to see their relative standing slide relative to China. That's simply in terms of physical trade. Foreign direct investment flows follows a similar logic. But thirdly, the critical area remains what now happens with the unfolding digital economy. China's strategy on the digital economy across the BRI countries is quite plain through what they describe as the digital Silk Road. Can we achieve a level of regulatory harmony between India and the United States on the unfolding digital economy and unleash these two huge centres of consumer demand into each other's accelerating set of economic opportunities? So the potential here is rich. The question is whether the geopolitics will bring about the paradigm shift which the geopolitics should generate, or will it be a series of incremental and domestically politically driven decisions which maybe takes the relationship ahead 10% beyond where it is at present, rather than the 100% and 1,000% change that it probably needs?
Great. Well, let's turn to India's economy squarely. For a long time now, economists around the world, American firms have wanted India to increasingly open up and reform. We've seen over the past couple of months widespread farmer protests against the Indian government's recently announced agricultural market reforms. And there was a reporting yesterday that the government is thinking about suspending implementation of those reforms for a year and a half potentially. And this could, of course, be a potential setback for the government's economic reform push. We've already mentioned a number of question marks with Prime Minister Modi's Self-Reliant India campaign and what that means about India's economic orientation. And to make matters worse, both countries, the United States and India's top priority in 2021 will be beating back the pandemic and really starting an economic recovery. We saw in India that we really just suffered a recession, an official recession with 2 consecutive quarters of negative growth. The Biden administration's Build Back Better campaign also likely is focused on calibrating U.S. foreign policy with domestic priorities at the same time. So given all these pressures, I wanted to ask, what we can expect from the Indian economy. Nisha, how have American firms viewed some of these developments over the past year in India, and what do the economic policies of both of these governments in the coming year, what does that mean for the U.S.-India commercial partnership?
Well, the U.S.-India economic corridor has been growing in importance and in attractiveness for investors in both directions. We've seen increasing Indian investment into the US, and we've seen increasing US investment into India. And the trade flows have also continued to grow. The challenge is that the trajectory of growth is not as steep as it could be, as it should be, because there continue to be different obstacles that crop up. And I think part of that is, is there a clear, consistent, predictable regulatory frame that allows investors to kind of price in the price of doing business in India and then be able to make big moves in confidence that those moves will pan out over the number of years because there will be a stable regulatory environment. I think the extent to which there is instability and inconsistency from year to year, that inhibits the investment. And so the number one thing that I think we push for is to create a long-term and stable outlook in terms of what India's, economic policies and trade policies are going to be, and then to be able to have the opening up be done in a way that's transparent and predictable. On the U.S. side, I think, of course, there's a lot of pressure due to the pandemic on how do we regrow American jobs and restart the economic engine. But on the other hand, there's also a deep recognition that the American economy is very much contingent on, export-led growth and our ability to be engaged globally. And so I think you will see that while there may be some efforts to try to incentivize production at home, that there's also a deep recognition that American industry is globally oriented and American markets are globally, significant. And so that policy, I think, will continue to drive the Biden administration's trade agenda as well. Even if it may not be in the first 100 days, I think it will come, and it will come in a very robust way.
Master Menon, you've already kind of talked about how this is likely to be one of the hardest spheres of cooperation for these two countries. Can you talk a little bit about, what the Biden Build Back Better campaign and what the U.S. focus and the Biden administration's focus domestically, how that might constrain this economic partnership from India's perspective?
Well, I'm not sure that it will necessarily constrain this relationship, because I do think that India can contribute in significant ways, whether it is, if you look at Indian investment in the US, jobs created by Indian industry in the US over the last few years, these have been steadily rising. If you look at the possible and the potential in the future, especially of the digital economy, what it could do for both economies, for the US rebuilding of itself and for India itself. For me, digital and IT, that's a space, cyber as a whole, is a space where there's tremendous potential, actually. So I don't necessarily see a domestic economic focus by the administration, by the Biden administration, as being a constraining factor. No. In fact, it opens up new opportunities in new and renewable energy, in the digital space. I mean, there's a whole host of things. And in some ways, it helps, because many of these issues, energy and so on, get complicated when they become international negotiations. It's easier to negotiate these things bilaterally to see what you can do together to further your own interests, rather than to try and get everybody's interests aligned. So when you make it a multilateral climate change negotiation, you've seen how complicated that is. And it also becomes domestically contentious. You've seen that with climate change in the past. Whereas when it's a bilateral negotiation on how do we shift to renewable energy, that actually is something that is politically also much easier for both sides to do. There's obvious benefits. So I don't see a domestic focus as being necessarily a constraining factor on India-US economic relations. In fact, it might be useful if we start concentrating on what's important rather than and what can actually contribute to our economic recovery after the pandemic, rather than trying to settle all the problems of the world and the problems of global governance and so on.
Kevin, anything to add?
Can I add to what Shankar just said about climate as both a challenge and an opportunity for India? The challenge is clear in terms of the impact on the Indian natural environment and in time the economy itself, and the intersecting area of air pollution and particulate matter concentration in major Indian cities like Delhi. So the overwhelming, as it were, domestic imperative, as Shankar just said, for India to act on climate is crystal clear to those of us who analyse climate change policy, politics, and the underpinning science carefully. Secondly, though, the temptation in Delhi is often to see this as a cost rather than opportunity, whereas the opportunity in terms of a genuine renewable energy revolution at a pace in excess of what we've seen in India so far is huge, with large-scale new employment opportunities right across the Indian economy. And the third point is this, and it's very important that Delhi, I think, understands this factor, that the one lane of strategic collaboration which is likely to work between Beijing and Washington in 2021 is the climate change collaboration lane. There is a desire on both parts to restore that level of cooperation to where it was in 2014-15 in the lead up to the Paris Agreement, where Xi Jinping undertook changes in China's policy and posture, and of course Obama met him in that endeavour. Now there's a deep interest in both countries to do this again. There's a danger that if India adopts a defensive position going into the Conference of the Parties in Glasgow of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change later this year, that India will find itself left out in the cold from this level of bilateral collaboration between Beijing and Washington. So my strong counsel to our friends in Delhi is do not allow that to occur, which means that India will internationally need to adopt a more forward-leaning posture. Final point is that in the bilaterals between Biden and Prime Minister Modi, the climate change question will appear on the president's talking points within the first 3 of those points, in my judgment. It will not be at the margins of his bilateral concerns with India. It'll be at the center. It will be China, the economy, plus climate will be the way in which I think the Americans will approach it. So if India wishes to, as it were, revolutionize the India-US relationship, then climate will be part of that mix.
Great, thank you. You know, just as climate has now re-entered the US federal government's agenda, with the start of the Biden administration, democracy and human rights are also now back on the US agenda and will be so in a visible way. Even before the unprecedented insurrection in Washington on January 6th, Joe Biden had signaled that there would be a focus on shoring up these institutions and norms at home, domestically. But you've already seen through, for example, the incoming National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan's Twitter feed, that the administration will make an effort to speak out and speak up for democratic ideals globally. And this is going to be a change between the White House we have seen for the past years. So let me ask each of you how that might manifest itself, this focus, this reshoring up of democratic values not just at home, but globally by the US administration, and what impact that might have on the US-India relationship. Ambassador Menon, we'll start with you. How does this renewed focus on democracy and human rights going to shape the US-India partnership?
Well, it's something that those are the sets of values that actually we've always argued has built the relationship, that those are values that underpin the relationship. But like all democracies, we're pretty raucous. We criticize ourselves and we criticize each other. India has been much less interested in exporting democracy than the US has been. Maybe because, frankly, India has had other more pressing concerns and does not regard itself as the city on the hill, as an example which others have to follow, or as responsible in some ways of setting a good example. Today, I think we are in an unprecedented situation where within both countries, we have large sections of our own population questioning our own adherence to our own values. And that's not a situation we're used to in the past. So this is not just two settled democracies now trying to see how these values can help them to develop the relationship in the future. And my worry is that India-US conversations on democracy become part of that internal contestation within India, within the US. And if we become part of that internal contestation of each other's domestic politics on democracy, on human rights, on protection of minorities, on religious freedoms, then frankly, it complicates the relationship. But I do think this is ultimately an issue that each of our societies has to sort out for itself. It's not something that external pressure or external conversation is going to settle. We have to settle for ourselves how democratic and how we're going to implement our own principles, the ones that our constitutions, our founding fathers gave us. And that's something that each of us has to sort out for ourselves, I do think.
Great. Nisha, as Ambassador Menon just mentioned, both countries, both governments will need to find a way to avoid getting involved in the domestic political contentions on these issues. How do you see the Biden administration balancing, its genuine concerns about human rights, minority rights in India? During the campaign, there were statements made about security lockdown in Kashmir, for instance. How do you see them balancing those concerns with the obvious need to continue the relationship, advance the relationship, and consolidate it over the coming 4 years?
Well, I think that as two democracies that do share so much in terms of our values or orientations, as well as two societies that are continually seeking to perfect our own unions, that we can have a dialogue and a discourse and have it be one that is approached with a sense of humility, a sense of respect and partnership, and be able to have conversations about challenges that we are facing in our own countries and how we're handling them and the lessons that we can learn from each other. But we stand together stronger when we stand together as democracies. And I think that will be a key part. It is not a tactical, needs-based relationship that animates the US-India partnership. It is a partnership that is bedrock to our status as democracies who have shared aspirations both within our societies of our people, but also of the world that we inhabit. So I think that's a conversation that could and should take place in a way that's constructive and not disruptive to the larger strategic relationship and the convergence on the strategic and security front.
Great. Kevin, we just have a minute left, so I'll come to you on this topic to close out the discussion. We've really seen over the past 4 years, China really impose itself in ways we haven't seen before in the region. And that has coincided with the US retrenchment, especially when it comes to leadership on these kinds of issues, on these values, on the protection of the liberal international order, Asia Pacific. Given the start of the Biden administration, what is the opportunity now for, what's the challenge and what's the opportunity for the new administration as it starts to re-engage the United States on these issues, and broadly speaking, re-engages the United States on issues of regional stability, regional order, more broadly?
Look, foreign policy is not a science, it's an art. And foreign policy is constantly dealing with a complexity of not just issues that you encounter, but also the values which you seek to articulate into that policy in relation to countries around the world. And so there is no particular rocket science in this. And human rights for all of our democracies, the American democracy, the Indian democracy, the Australian democracy, is a central feature of who we are as people. So that's just a given. Secondly, I think given the strategic dimensions of the India-US relationship, and emphasizing what Nisha has just underlined herself, the fact that these are two rambunctious democracies should be able to accommodate a level of candor about human rights concerns. But I think in the case of the United States, it will be candor which will be contextualized within this enormous potential for the wider strategic and economic relationship and pan-regional relationship as well. So therefore, I think it can be managed. Of course, the ball to some extent will be in Prime Minister Modi's court as to how he handles these questions. And domestic politics is not something I'm about to provide him with advice on from my perch as president of the Asia Society, but he himself will control some of the levers on this question as well.
Well, thank you very much for what was a fantastic discussion. We've run out of time. I want to thank our esteemed guests for, one, allowing me to grill them and really sharing their insights with the Asia Society global audience. Thank you to the Asia Society India Center, again, for partnering with us on this very timely discussion. Ambassador Menon, Nisha, Kevin, thank you very much for participating.
Thanks so much, Anubhav. And to Shankar and to Nisha, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.